Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. We're joined again today by Dr. Elizabeth Connelly from the International Energy Agency, who's going to talk to us about an area where she is a particularly well-versed expert, electric and hybrid vehicles. There's a lot more to the topic than what you might see on social media or on the local news, especially when we want to consider the broader questions that pop up when we're thinking about what needs to happen for EVs to be as big a part of our lives as the government appears to want them to be. Now, don't worry, there's a lot of good news in there, and we're going to talk about all that today on this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thinking a little bit more about your specific area of expertise on the electric vehicle side, and I would recommend that anybody who needs more information about this go to the IEA's website, because there's a lot of really good information. It's very well presented, easy to understand, about not just electric vehicles, but all of these energy issues. So we're going to put some links in our show notes to that, but specifically on electric vehicles. When I was looking through, there were some recommendations I saw that the IEA gave. So let's talk about a little bit about each of these from your perspective. So the first one, maintain and adapt support for electric cars. And again, this is a worldwide view, not just the United States view. Would you say that the rest of the world is ahead of the game as far as at least generating or maintaining support for electric cars?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think the U.S. is doing an admirable job for supporting electric cars. I think one of the maybe most commonly thought of policy mechanisms for supporting electric car sales is purchase subsidies. In the U.S., we wouldn't call it a subsidy, but a tax rebate, but I think it's the same kind of mechanism. So we're trying to close this gap in the purchase price between electric cars and conventional cars. And so that's something a lot of countries have done. I think in general, advanced economies are in a better place to offer these kinds of things. I think tax rebates, since it's not actually handing out money, is also a bit more possible for more emerging economies as well. So this is something that we see being used widely. And I think what our recommendation means by adapting support for electric cars is that we expect as markets mature, these purchase subsidies or financial incentives for purchasing electric cars can start being phased out. We've seen that in a number of countries. So I think China's a good success story for that. So they ended, I think at the beginning of 2023, they gradually phased down. And then in 2023, there was no longer a purchase subsidy for electric cars. But what we found in our analysis in the Global EV Outlook report this year is that in 2022, we were seeing a decent share of electric cars offered at price parity with conventional cars. And in 2023, so last year, it was something like 60% of the electric cars sold in China were cheaper than what we'd consider the conventional equivalent, so based on size class. So I think this is a perfect example of where you don't need these purchase incentives anymore because the market's brought down the price enough to be competitive. And so then we can consider that public support for EVs should be adapted or shift into a different direction. And so one example of how that could work is really funding or facilitating the deployment of public charging infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting what you said about China and about those price points. Of course, the Chinese, as we've alluded to earlier, they have some influences on their market that are stronger, shall we say, than we have in the United States. But I know that one of the things that consumers talk about with EVs here is the fact that they seem to be, at least the perception is, that they are more expensive. What do you think, if price parity was achieved in China, what do you think the biggest reason for that was? Was it central fiscal policy by the Chinese government or something else?
Certainly it's a combination of factors, but one of the things that I think is really helpful for China is that domestically they're able to scale technologies a lot just using their own market, right? So just the size of China's market means that they can scale up new technologies very quickly. I think another thing China has going for it is these kind of more integrated supply chains. So China has kind of dominates a lot of the steps of the EV supply chain, including critical mineral processing, including EV battery
Yes.
production, and then also EV production. So that helps also
Hmm.
keep costs lower. And then I think what we've seen in China is just there's also this very fierce competition between EV makers. And so this leads to the automakers driving down costs to try to compete. And that's worked out well for the consumers.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting what you say about the supply chains and about the metals and the battery production, because what that reminds me of is when you were first talking a few minutes ago about what's happening in the Chinese market, the first thing that popped into my mind was the fact that they supply much of many of the components and the materials that go to the rest of the world. And so it reminded me of here in the United States how gas prices are different depending on how close you are to the source. It seemed to me that if the EV makers are close to the source, shall we say, as far as getting these materials, that would give them an advantage, which may not necessarily be reflected as easily in the United States. Maybe the United States will have to take other measures in order to try and drive this price parity, because we don't have the option of being close to the source when it comes to some of these needed materials to produce the batteries and things that go into these electric vehicles.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things, though, is to mention is it's more for China, they aren't necessarily the ones that have the critical mineral reserves. So I agree
Mm-hmm.
that they still dominate most of the supply chain, and that's very helpful for them. But I don't think it's impossible for the US to start opening up industrial opportunities for other parts of the supply chain. And I think
Mm-hmm.
the IRA is trying to do that. So trying to onshore EV battery production and
Mm-hmm.
incentivize the domestic processing of critical minerals, these kinds of things. So China certainly has a head start, but I think it's not out of the question that the U.S. could start spurring these kinds of domestic supply chains as well.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned the IRA because I did a podcast episode, maybe about a year ago, where I talked about the IRA and about how there were some elements in that which kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people. I don't know if it's because of the name of the act, but there were some elements of it that really are going to help make this kind of thing easier, but a lot of people don't realize that. The Biden administration has done investment in the kinds of technologies needed to help drive this. It seems to me that they've taken some positive steps in that regard.
Making domestic supply chains in the U.S. So
Just stepping back to China for just a minute, do you know anything about how their relationship with Taiwan and the chips that go into these vehicles? What I've heard is that Taiwan makes a lot of the chips, and that's one of the reasons they want to keep Taiwan close to the vest, because Taiwan, not China, actually produces all of these critical components that China not only needs, but the United States needs. And so that is why the average American consumer would do well to pay attention to world geopolitics and what's happening in that part of the world, because if something were to happen with China and Taiwan, that could really negatively affect what other countries like us are trying to do.
right. I mean, I don't know specifically about how much of the chips come from Taiwan, but I think you're pointing out a very good point that the future energy transition has new supply chains that are developing. And
Mm-hmm.
so, as I was mentioning before, kind of the idea of what energy security is changing. And I think at the IEA, we're looking more and more into the supply chains for clean energy technologies. And for EVs, we've mostly focused on
Mm-hmm.
where the EV batteries and the battery components come from. But certainly that's not all
Yep.
of the key components. So I think it's a good point to consider where are chips being produced, and is it possible to diversify all steps of the supply chain really.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems the world is continually getting more complicated than people want to give it credit for. And that's why it's becoming increasingly important to pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world, because everything works together. We don't at least in my viewpoint, we don't have the luxury as Americans to just kind of sit here and say, well, we're just going to do what we're going to do, because what everybody else does materially affects what we can do on multiple levels. So talking about domestically, you were talking about things that governments can do to achieve price parity. And one of the things that I remembered when you were talking about that was, I don't know how many months ago, but it was the new EPA fuel efficiency guide rules that were put into place. Did an episode on that to try and explain what the significance was. And I remember that, to me, is one of the things that is going to have a really, really big effect on driving, maybe even forcing implementation and use of EVs here in the United States, because these manufacturers are going to be forced to make like 60% of their fleets are going to have to be electric vehicles, and it's going to happen soon. And I don't know if the Biden administration is not our next presidential administration. I don't know if their successors will change that, but seems to me that that is one of the ways that, at least in the United States, the government can put its thumb on the scale of trying to drive people towards these kind of things that are important, whether it's tax policy, as you talked about, or through regulatory measures.
Right. I mean, I think the US EPA standards that were released in, I think it was March, just as we were talking about this implementation gap, this is something that Biden had set, the Biden administration had set a 50% EV sales target by 2030, and this EPA standard would meet that, if not exceed it. So I think for us, that was an exciting policy development. I know you can get criticism from both sides on whether it was stringent enough, but I think it's undeniable that it will support the EV market. And I think something interesting, we try to look at also what industry players are doing and what they're saying. And I think most automakers at this point have EVs as in part of their long-term plan. If not every car maker, then all of the major car makers. And when we look at OEMs selling cars in the US, we see that collectively their targets for 2030 would support reaching a 50% sales share. So to me, I think there are some people on looking at policy that is kind of to some extent pushing EV sales, and they're saying, oh, well, we're not ready for that. But I think the industry also has that same vision in their heads. So to me, I think it speaks, it says a lot about our preparedness to meet these kind of EV targets.
Yeah, and when I've talked about how things might be changing here in the United States and this coming wave of electric vehicles, where there's going to be more and more, or a greater and greater percentage of those of new car sales are going to be electric vehicles. I know you mentioned earlier, one of the really big things that I think we haven't really seen being implemented, but it's coming, and it's going to have to come in order to drive this here in the United States, is the charging infrastructure. And how I know the Biden administration has already started setting aside money to start making changes. And I'm known around here as kind of an EV apologist. You know, there are some folks that don't like them. I think they're great, and I'll argue all day long about the value for EVs, not just relative to net zero, but just in and of themselves. But I recognize that you have to have places to charge electric vehicles. And from what the sense that I've gotten in reading about the stated objectives for the Biden administration, what they'd like to see is they want to have, I think they said 500,000 charging stations in the United States, which, as far as I know, is about 2 to 3 times the number of gas stations that we have. And so when I explain this to people, I'm like, look, 10 or 20 years from now, we're going to look back on the way it is now, and it's basically going to be like, you don't drive down the road right now, today, and say, I wonder if I'll come across a gas station. You just assume you'll come across a gas station. And I think that's the way it's going to be. I think that's the way it's going to have to be for the United States and every other country in order to drive this adoption. So I think that's something that's going to require a lot of massive investment on all levels, because it's not just building those, right? It's modifying these grids, making the power grids, bringing those up to date, making them smart grids. How do you see that kind of thing being addressed in not just in the United States, but in some of these other advanced and emerging economies? If you can speak to that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree in that charging infrastructure, especially public charging infrastructure, is going to be critical to enable EV adoption. I think looking at the current availability of public charging, it can be a bit difficult to compare across countries. We've looked at various metrics that could help us decide who's doing well and who's not doing well, but it's tricky because I think in advanced EV markets, let's say, so let's consider Norway maybe the most advanced in this case. They've got sustained sales over 80% for a while. Exactly, I know. They're paving the way. But the thing is, in Norway, there's a lot of single-family homes. And to some extent, that's also true in the US. So that gives the opportunity to have a home charger. And so for the most part, it's going to always be more expensive to charge outside of home than at home because you can charge slowly overnight and wake up the next day and go to work and have the charge for that. I think so in countries where we expect high percentages of EV owners to have home charging availability, they'll do the majority of their charging there. That's certainly not to say that everyone with a home charger only charges at home. That's not true. Public charging is still important even in those cases. And I think thinking about disadvantaged communities or even plenty advantaged communities where they're not built around single family homes, but in perhaps large apartment buildings, this kind of thing, there needs to be chargers there. Yeah, exactly. And I know the U.S. Government is also really starting to take a look at kind of the idea of installing curbside chargers for people who live in cities and maybe don't have access even to a private garage and have to park on the street. And so you're looking to install chargers there so that they can also charge overnight or while they're parked in front of a business, that kind of thing. EV infrastructure is maybe the most important thing countries need to be thinking about in terms of promoting EV adoption. And I think, one of the reasons that no matter what stage the country is at today in terms of EV adoption, it's important to really think ahead for charging. Not only because it takes some time to build the chargers, but if you're connecting to the grid, there can be queues for grid connections. And there can also be just, if grid upgrades are needed, then that can also take a long time. So one of our really key recommendations is that governments need to be taking anticipatory measures to build out and upgrade grids before those become a bottleneck for EV adoption, given these long lead times. And then another aspect that I think you touched on is there needs to be the implementation of smart charging, because if EVs aren't smart charging, they can be a challenge for the grid to handle. But with smart charging, they can offer benefits to the grid. And so we could see benefits such as being able to increase renewable integration and also reducing system flexibility needs. And so we've seen even in the UK, they've announced regulations, I think back in 2022, to ensure smart charging functionality of their chargers. And then in China, there's been a call for technical standards for vehicle grid integration. So we're seeing countries starting to think about how to implement policies and standards that are to meet this end.
Yeah, can you, for the folks that don't know, what defines smart charging versus what they might think of charging as for EVs?
Sure. I mean, I think the standard charging is you just plug your car in and it starts charging basically as fast as it can. Smart charging has the ability to kind of understand to some extent, well, there's multiple versions of smart charging. The smartest charging, I think, really has interactions with the grid and knows when it's beneficial to pull energy. And if you have vehicle to grid capabilities, you could even discharge energy from the vehicle battery back to the grid. But there's also what's called, so that's V2G, so vehicle to grid. But there's also a step in between they're still connected, but it's more you choose smartly what time of day the car gets charged. So the user might plug it in while they're at work, but
Mhm.
it only charges when there's excess capacity on the grid. It's just the idea that you pull the energy when it's not going to cause problems for the grid, but also do it in a way where if you know you need to drive home from work at, say, 5 p.m., it's also making sure that you're going to have enough energy in the battery to do that.
And that makes sense. The average person probably doesn't realize that there are those kinds of options and or the need for those kinds of things when you're talking about how an electrical grid or power grid works. It makes a lot of sense that instead of just a static, you're charging this much for this amount of time, but vary how and when the power is pulled, that will make the grid much better able to service a large influx of electric vehicles that are pulling from it. To me, it reminds me of how they have had to modify internet availability and how you see in communities, you know, not everybody is on the internet streaming their Netflix at the same time, right? There are certain times a day when the spikes go up, and that, of course, is when all the kids get out of school. But they have made changes, I'm sure, to you might call smart internet transmission. They would call it something different. But yeah, it makes sense that for electric vehicle charging, that's what they're going to have to incorporate are some of these smart charging functionalities. And then you talk about street charging. A lot of people do not realize that when you talk about internet, like let's say internet availability, use that as a proxy for what we're talking about. The single biggest area of the country that has the most number of people that do not have access to home high-speed internet is New York City, because they have all those apartment buildings that haven't been wired for that. And same for electric vehicles. There, you don't have a whole lot of single-family homes in the middle of New York City, so I would imagine that it's going to be really important for the federal and state governments to work together to help bring this to those huge population centers.
Yeah, exactly. We're seeing in several countries built into the building codes are these requirements for basically being capable to install chargers. Not necessarily that all new buildings have to come with chargers, but must be able to have that added later, because I think it's inevitable that we'll need EV chargers basically everywhere at a certain point. And so it's better that construction of buildings, which buildings last, I don't know, 50 years or more, it depends where you are. But it's really important to kind of plan for the EV transition so that things aren't as difficult and don't require as much retrofits.
Well, and you raise a great point. Something that I hadn't considered is the role of building codes and how simply changing the rules, so to speak, to require that seems like that would be really important to do that. And you said they're doing that in other countries. They said Norway. What are some of the other countries, cities or countries that are doing well in that respect?
Sure. I mean, I think from a policy perspective, the EU has a lot of really advanced policies that are pushing electric vehicles. So last year they passed their CO2 standard, which in effect bans internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035, unless they're running on sustainable fuels, which I think that definition will be worked out later when we get closer to 2035. But the EU also, I think they do a great job of trying to craft policy that takes into consideration multiple aspects. So beyond just having the CO2 standard, which is going to, in effect, really push electric vehicles, they have a regulation called the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, which is requiring member states, so all the EU countries, to start building out charging infrastructure on their kind of core highway network. And I think they've set a minimum distance of 60 kilometers that can be between chargers. And that's starting, I think, comes into effect just next year. And within that, too, they try to send signals to utilities and others that this will have to happen. And so it's important to start planning for that.
That seems like something that inevitably is going to have to happen here in the United States, because that's one of the big concerns. about whether it's consumers or people in the heavy-duty hauling transportation sector, the fact that they're not sure when they're going to come across a charging station.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I will give some props to the US because in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there is this program. I'm trying to think, the NEVI program is how I refer to it. I think it's the National EV Infrastructure Program. And it's also looking at building out corridors for charging. And so basically giving states money to build out chargers along highways. I'm not as sure if there's minimum distance requirements, but I know states have this open call for proposals and then they have to select which ones get funded. And I think at least within the decision criteria, it's making sure you have a good coverage across the full state, across the highway network. And so I think there's the movement in the right direction there too. And that program has $5 billion behind it. So I think it's going to make a good difference.
Do you happen to know if there are any date goals associated with that? Provided nothing gets changed, of course, when they're supposed to have this done by?
Right. So some of the first stations that have been funded under the NEVI program are already opening and operating. I think different states are running into potentially different challenges, and I think there's some EV charging point operators that are faster to act than others. And so at least the first round of funding that has flown to the states has been distributed to the charging point operators, is my understanding. And how quickly those get up and running can be, more of a question mark. But I think the NEVI program, if I'm not mistaken, is allocating funding over 5 years. And we've already had the funding from the first year allocated to businesses, I think, and then it starts opening up funding. They don't release it all. They need to make sure the program's working properly. We're seeing progress there already on the ground.
You may or may not know about this, but I figured I'd ask it anyway. Do you know anything about recent news about Tesla's charging stations, and are they changing their policy to where what I heard or read was that they are either not going to let people use, at least from my understanding, what they had always said they were going to do, which is have Tesla charging stations that everybody could use, for lack of a better way to put it. Do you know anything about whether they're planning to change any of that?
Yeah, so I don't fully know the details. I can say that I think what influenced their agreement to open up their chargers to other vehicles is that to qualify for this NEVI funding, to get the government funding, they had to be able to charge non-Teslas. It needs to be more interoperable for other vehicles. And so I think that was a big influence in this kind of previous announcement that they'd be opening up their network. As far as what's happened recently goes, I'm not fully aware of the details. I've heard a rumor that Elon Musk let go of his charging team.
I did read that.
So I don't know what that means for the future, because I think a lot of people would have looked at the success of the Tesla charging infrastructure and thought that team would be safe from such a reaction. But so we'll have to see how they bounce back.
Yeah, when I read that seemed really strange to me. I know the devil's always in the details with this kind of thing, but yeah, they must have something else in mind. I guess we'll see. But yeah, I was surprised when I read about that. I hope you enjoyed the second part of our discussion with Dr. Elizabeth Connelly from the International Energy Agency. And there's one more part to come, because there's still more to unpack about electric vehicles, especially concerning a part that we haven't really touched on yet: how businesses and the heavy-duty transportation sector are going to be affected by this movement toward vehicle electrification. So don't miss the final part of our discussion as we wrap this up. As always, we'll be putting links in the show notes to whatever we talked about today. Now, if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe to the show at your podcast purveyor of choice and leave us a rating while you're at it. And we'll see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.